Welcome to Homeostasis in Selected Organ Systems, Part 1. Each cell engages in basic metabolic activities that assure its own survival. At the same time, cells, tissues, and organs perform activities that contribute to the survival of the body as a whole. The combined contributions of cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems help maintain a stable internal environment, which is required for our body's functioning and survival. This concept helps understand the function of any organ system regardless of its complexity. Homeostasis is the formal name for the stable operating conditions in the internal environment. Any number of cells' activity can change the body's internal environment. This term refers to the bloodstream and the fluids that bathe all your body cells. Cells are continually taking up substances and producing others, and this biochemical give and take alters the composition of blood and tissue fluid. Unregulated, these changes would eventually kill the cells. Fortunately, your kidney and other elements of the urinary system work to keep this disaster at bay. Governing all this activity are the body's command post, the nervous system, and the endocrine system. This hierarchy illustrates specialization and division of labor, which permits the existence of complex organisms. Homeostasis is derived from the Greek words for same and steady, refers to any process that living things use to actively maintain fairly stable conditions necessary for survival. It describes how the body maintains steady levels of temperature and other vital conditions such as water, salt, sugar, calcium, oxygen contents of the blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, etc. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment, the immediate surrounding of cells, in response to changes in the changing conditions of the external environment and the changing conditions of the internal environment. Homeostasis is a self-adjusting mechanism involving feedback, where the response to a stimulus alters the conditions and may itself become a new stimulus. Homeostasis works to maintain the organism's internal environment within tolerance limits, the narrow range of conditions where cellular processes are able to function. In the human body, physiological mechanisms help keep oxygen level up and carbon dioxide down. That's your respiratory system, nutrients up, your digestive system, waste low, your kidneys, temperature constants, muscles and sweat, etc. It is important to remember that this does not imply homeostasis is an unchanging state. In fact, there are constant adjustments being made to the balance, to maintain the balance where internal conditions are appropriate. These conditions are always varying, but within very narrow limits. Some responses are occurring inside your body without your awareness. Homeostasis would be impossible if we did not respond to internal stimuli. So, for instance, you have receptors, special baroreceptors that detect changes in blood pressure. And if you have a decrease or a drop in blood pressure, these receptors will send that information. Sensory cells will pick this up. These receptors will send that information into the central nervous system. And in the central nervous system, there will be a integration of that information, and a response will be sent out. And the nervous system causes your heart rate to increase and vasoconstriction of your vessels, and this would then increase your blood pressure. Feedback mechanisms are always the general mechanism of nervous and hormonal control. Essentially, feedback occurs when the response to a stimulus has an effect of some kind on the original stimulus. Negative feedback is when the response diminishes the original stimulus, and positive feedback is when the response enhances the original stimulus. Feedback loops are used extensively in the regulation of hormones and the hypothalamus and pituitary. Positive feedback is significantly less common, as most changes to steady state or homeostasis pose a threat, and to enhance them would worsen the situation. However, a good example of a positive feedback is with a baby suckling for milk, suckling the mother's nipple, and there are a few drops of milk released. And this encourages the baby and releases a hormone that goes up into the mother's brain and stimulates the release of a hormone that goes through the blood and causes more milk to be released. So this is a positive feedback, and this makes sense because if it was a negative feedback, suckling decreased milk flow, you'd have an unhappy baby. Negative feedback is where the output of a pathway inhibits the pathway. So, for instance, the heating system in your home is a simple negative feedback circuit. When the furnace produces enough heat to elevate the temperature above the set point of the thermostat is triggered and shuts off the furnace. Heat is feeding back negatively on the source of heat. And then as the room cools to the set point below, the negative feedback is gone and the furnace comes back on. Homeostasis works to maintain the organism's internal environment within tolerance limits. So, for instance, if we look at pH, blood pH, it's maintained within a very narrow range of 7.35 to 7.45. If it goes below 6.8 or above 8, this will result in death. The organ systems work together to keep oxygen up and carbon dioxide down and nutrients up and wastes and temperature and maintain homeostatic range. All feedback mechanisms have 5 components. A stimulus, so this produces a change in a variable. The stimulus is detected by a receptor, which is generally in the nervous system, a sensory receptor. The receptor then sends that information via the afferent pathway to the control center, which is generally the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. The control center will integrate that information and send output along the efferent pathway to the effector. And the effector is what has a response, and it feeds back to influence the magnitude of the stimulus and returns the variable to homeostasis. An easy example of this would be to consider is insulin and glucagon, and we'll be seeing this in the lab in the future. Here we're keeping blood glucose under homeostatic levels. So an increase we see after eating, your blood glucose increases, and this is detected by cells in the pancreas. So you have receptor cells in the pancreas, which integrate the information and cause the secretion of the hormone insulin. Insulin then travels in the blood to the kidney, where glucose is taken up and stored as glycogen, to the muscles, where glucose is taken up and stored as glycogen, and to the adipose cells, where fat is stored. This brings glucose levels back to homeostatic range. In between eating meals, the blood glucose drops, and glucagon and other cells in the pancreas will secrete glucagon, which cause fat cells to release fat that is broken down and released to be used as fuel, and the liver breaks down stored glycogen into glucose and releases it into the blood. So we'll start by doing an overview of a few of the systems. We'll start with the respiratory system, which of course the main function is to bring in a fresh supply of oxygen from the external environment, and then working along with the circulatory system to bring that oxygen to all the cells and to eliminate excess carbon dioxide. So that's the gas of exchange, the intake of oxygen and removal of carbon dioxide that occurs in the lungs. There's also a sensory component that we'll be looking at later, which has receptors for smell. The respiratory system produces sound, the larynx. It filters and warms and moistens air, so that occurs in the nasal cavity, the trachea, and the bronchi. The chemical, why do we need oxygen? You must have oxygen available for life to exist. And that is because the chemical reactions that release energy from food require oxygen. The air that we breathe consists of about 20% oxygen, and both the respiratory and cardiovascular systems work together to distribute oxygen to all the cells of the body. Certain cells are able to be hypoxic or live without oxygen. However, the brain cells, your neurons, will start dying within 5 minutes in an anoxic or hypoxic environment. As a result, brain hypoxia can cause very severe brain damage rapidly, and your brain can only survive for up to 6 minutes after your heart stops. So let's start with looking at the upper respiratory system, the upper respiratory tract. You have sinuses. These are cavities in the skull that serve basically to lighten the weight of your cranium, and they also serve to warm and moisten the air. Air enters the nasal cavity by the nostrils, and it's warmed to body temperature and moistened by the membranes that line the passage. You have the sense of smell that enables you to identify various particles in the air, and you filter out some dust at this point. The pharynx is a passageway at the back of the mouth where both food and air pass. The lower respiratory tract, we see the epiglottis, and this is a distinct triangular flap of tissue over the anterior end of the larynx, and this covers the larynx during swallowing, preventing food in the pharynx from entering the larynx. The larynx is that portion of air passage that contains the vocal cords. Air passes between the vocal cords through a space called the glottis. And in the course of humanoid evolution, the larynx has moved caudally up towards our head, and as a result, human vocalizations tend to come out of the mouth, where the tongue can manipulate them. In chimps, the larynx is higher in the throat, with the result that vocalizations are very nasal and less controllable and understandable. The trachea connects the larynx with the bronchi, leading to each lung, and it's basically an air conduction. Posterior to the trachea, posterior to the larynx is the trachea, and it has cartilaginous rings on the dorsal side to maintain that airway constantly open. The cells in the trachea are ciliated and interspersed with mucus-secreting cells, and they move particles trapped in the mucus and other foreign particles away from the lungs. The trachea splits into two bronchi, which carry air from the trachea into each lung. The portion of the thorax that contains the lungs is called the thoracic cavity, and the lungs, of course, are the site of exchange. The breathing muscles, we have intercostal muscles that move your rib cage during breathing, and then a large flap of skeletal muscle called the diaphragm that actually separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity and plays a huge role in breathing. So, in breathing, the active portion is actually inspiration, and the ridge cave moves up and out, intercostals contract, the diaphragm contracts and moves down, and that means that the chest cavity increases, the thoracic cavity increases inside, and the pressure in the cavity, in the lungs, decreases, and air actually just moves down its pressure gradient. So air moves down its pressure gradient. Expiration or exhalation is a passive process that the diaphragm relaxes and moves back up towards the thorax. The chest cavity decreases in size, and the pressure in the lungs increases, and air again moves out passively down its pressure gradient. So the sequence of events are: the inspiratory muscles contract, the diaphragm moves down, the ribcage rises, the thoracic cavity volume increases, the lungs are stretched, intrapulmonary volume increases, intrapulmonary pressure drops, then air and gases flow into the lungs down the pressure gradient until interpulmonary pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure. In the sequence of expiration, the inspiratory muscles relax, the diaphragm rises, the rib cage descends due to the recoil of cartilage. The thoracic cavity volume decreases. Elastic lungs recoil passively, intrapulmonary volume decreases, which means the pressure rises, and again, gases flow out of the lung down the pressure gradient until interpulmonary pressure is zero. The neurons that are mainly responsible for regulating breathing are in the medulla oblongata, which is the hindbrain. It's the most primitive portion of the brains. And there are neural circuits in the medulla that form breathing control center. In regulating breathing, the medulla uses pH of the surrounding tissue fluid as an indicator of concentration of carbon dioxide. And we've already seen this formula where carbon dioxide combines with water, and this is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase in the red blood cells to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid then dissociates to protons and bicarbonates. And under normal conditions, these protons will be buffered by the amino acids in the hemoglobin, and the bicarbonate enters the blood as the alkaline reserve. However, if we have increasing carbon dioxide levels increasing levels of carbon dioxide, such as when you're exercising and producing more carbon dioxide, that lowers the blood pH. And you have special chemoreceptors that are in major blood vessels, and they detect that decrease in blood pH. And they send that information via the afferent route into the medulla oblongata, the control center. The control center then integrates that and sends information out the afferent pathway, the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm and the intercostal nerves, to cause them to increase breathing rate. If you increase breathing rate, you blow off excess carbon dioxide, and that increases the pH back to normal, back to blood homeostatic levels. So we'll always use this as our framework. And this is just one of the models that we'll be seeing in the lab. So here we see their sinuses, the frontal and sphenoid sinus. Here we see the nasal cavity, and you'll note there are these channels or meatus, and that's actually to cause turbulence as the air comes into the nasal cavity to fling off any particulate matter so it clings to the hairs and the mucus. Here we see the epiglottis. Now the epiglottis will fold down over the glottis here so that food coming from the pharynx is forced into the esophagus and not into the trachea. So here we have the trachea, and we can see here the cartilaginous rings that help maintain the airway open. And then dorsal to that is the esophagus. And we'll be seeing models as well where we'll see the lungs and the diaphragm.